On February 24th, 2022, Russia escalated the 2014 Russia-Ukraine war into a full invasion of the country. There was a shared outrage around the world, with calls to support Ukraine protects its sovereignty. Western leaders faced growing pressure to go to Ukraine's aid.
At the same time, Germany certainly faces pressure from the government in Kiev, but also from Washington and other partners to do more. When it comes to weapons,
the military aid would come through for Ukraine, leading to the feeling that most European powers were trying to appease Russia. But the overwhelming support for arming Ukraine would die down slowly as the conflict dragged on. With Ukraine suffering heavy losses in damage to its cities, support for arming the country began to fall.
Protesters in Berlin rallying against sending battle tanks to Ukraine. A poll published this week shows support for sending heavy weapons like Leopard 2 tanks is down to 48% compared to 55% a few months ago.
Many continue to share a feeling that the West is fighting a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, leading to the destruction of the country in the process.
The debate is about keeping the weapons flowing to keep the war going. Ukraine is burning through a generation of men.
The United States has taken the leading role in military and humanitarian aid to Ukraine. By the time of making this video, the United States has sent over $77 billion in military, humanitarian, and financial aid to Ukraine. That is more aid than has been committed by all other countries combined. But the Biden administration's generosity towards Ukraine has not been sitting well with some in the conservative camp. Now there is a tussle in the US between conservatives and Democrats of aid to a country at the far end of Europe. Biden supporters feel the US should at least arm Ukraine to deal with Russia's aggression. His opponents, however, feel the crisis in Ukraine is Europe's problem, that the Biden administration should commit resources spent on Ukraine to deal with homelessness and the immigration crisis at the US border with Mexico.
Have you, I know you're running for president. You are distressed that the Ukrainians don't have enough American tanks. Every city in the United States has become much worse over the past 3 years. Yeah. Drive around. There's not one city that's gotten better in the United States. Right. And it's visible. Our economy has degraded. The suicide rate has jumped. Public filth and disorder and crime have exponentially increased. Right. And yet, your concern is that the Ukrainians, a country most people can't find on a map, who've received tens of billions of US tax dollars.
So, how are those against aid for Ukraine getting it so wrong? And in what ways do lessons from the First and Second World War vindicate White House's decision to spend big on Ukraine? I need to start by explaining how resistance to US intervention in wars in Europe is really not a new thing. It began as early as during the World War I in 1914. President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed that the United States would remain neutral in the conflict, a position supported by most Americans. However, the US soon realized it was difficult to have peace when war was raging on in far-off France, where America had vested interests. Germany would attack and sink armed merchant and passenger ships hoping to defeat the United Kingdom. For example, Germany sank an unarmed British ocean liner Lusitania in 1915, killing 2,000 people, among them 128 Americans. They started to change the American public attitude towards neutrality.
However, in 1915, the general sentiment began to shift in favour of the Allies. This was accelerated after the sinking of the Lusitania, with 120 Americans on board on the 7th of May.
But attacks continued with Germany sinking an armed French boat, the Sussex, in the English Channel in the March of 1916. This forced Woodrow Wilson to the negotiating table with Germany under the Sussex Pledge in May of 1916. According to the pledge, Germany would stop attacking passenger ships and allow crew of enemy merchant ships to disembark before any attack. But the Sussex Pledge would hardly last a year. Germany made the US realize it could not set the conditions for war it was not part of. With Germany continuing submarine warfare against US ships, on April of 1917, the US officially entered the conflict following the declaration of war on Germany. During World War I, United States would send over 2 million troops into Europe and would lose 50,000 by the time war concluded in 1918. But the United States did not appear to draw any lessons from its failed neutrality during World War I. The US needed to realize that it would be difficult to be at peace when the rest of the world was mad in wars of conquest. Few years prior to the Second World War, the United States committed to remain neutral in any future conflicts, doubling down on its isolationist and international policy. On October 5, 1937, United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt gave the quarantine speech declaring America's formal neutrality in any future global conflicts.
It seems to be unfortunately true that the epidemic of world lawlessness is spreading. And mark this well, when an epidemic of physical disease starts to spread, the community approves and joins in a quarantine of the patients in order to protect the health of the community against the spread of the disease. It is my determination to pursue a policy of peace. It is my determination to adopt every practicable measure to avoid involvement in war.
In its place, United States chose to use economic sanctions against what Roosevelt called aggressive nations. However, America's neutrality in the Second World War would be short-lived as well, following Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in a preemptive attempt to keep the US out of the war. Again, the United States had to learn the hard way that it could not set the conditions for war it was not party to. Eventually, the US was forced to declare war on the Empire of Japan, together with other Axis powers including Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. The United States remained active and the leading power in the conflict that lasted until 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Similar to outcomes in the World War I, United States ended up sending over 16 million of its men to fight in Europe, where it would lose about 400,000 of them, with about 700,000 troops being wounded. One of the main lessons from the First and Second World War for the US was that any attempt at neutrality ended up being costlier for the country. During World War I, the country had to commit 2 million of its productive men to the war and lose 50,000 of them in the process. During the Second World War, losses were 10 times greater and mobilization by the same magnitude. In both wars, US involvement was the deciding factor in the outcome of the war. Entering the war, it meant the US and its allies had to liberate more territories already conquered by Axis powers, which exacerbated civilian and military casualties. By going earlier to the conflict, United States would have reduced the scale of the invasion, saved a lot of lives, and reduced the duration of the war. By using the same neutrality principle in Ukraine, there was a likelihood the US would need to risk the lives of its soldiers should the Ukrainian crisis have spread to other former Soviet states. Second World War also showed the dangers of trying to appease autocratic regimes willing to use military force as means to an end. You see, during both World Wars, United Kingdom was the de facto superpower. During the 1930s, it carried the heavy burden of preventing another world war from happening in Europe. Its strategy, however, was one of appeasing Nazi Germany by allowing Hitler to occupy territories he felt had some German-speaking population. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, United Kingdom allowed Nazi Germany to occupy Rhineland unopposed, followed by annexation of Austria in March of 1938, and the occupation of Sudetenland, the German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia, in 1938. Neville Chamberlain would sign the Munich Agreement with Nazi Germany in 1938, allowing Germany to occupy the invaded territories in exchange for making no more territorial demands in Europe. But Hitler did not intend to observe the Munich Agreement, of course. As Putin has demonstrated, fascist leaders interpret conflict avoidance as a sign of weakness. Nazi Germany would show this after invading the rest of Czechoslovakia just 6 months after signing the Munich Agreement, and later invaded Poland in 1939, which marked the beginning of the Second World War. Surprisingly, Angela Merkel and Obama would copy Neville Chamberlain's appeasement strategy decades later with Russia. In 2008, Russia annexed some territories in Georgia, followed by annexation of Crimea in 2014. In both cases, Europe would choose to appease Putin by allowing him to occupy these territories, hoping to avert an even greater war between nuclear-armed parties in Europe. But Putin did not interpret the appeasement as a voice of reason. Rather, he doubled down on the use of force by launching a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So, if Biden White House allowed him to have his way in Ukraine, what would have stopped Russia from annexing other unallied former Soviet states? So, how would the US inaction of Russia's invasion of Ukraine lead to a potential Third World War? With the US allowing Russia to have its way in Ukraine, it would have served as a signal for China and other aggressive powers to pursue their territorial expansion objectives. With Ukraine falling to Russia in days, other unallied former Soviet states would likely have surrendered to Russia without a fight. China would have taken the opportunity to launch an invasion of Taiwan. China would also use the crisis to assert dominance in the South China Sea by forcing countries such as Vietnam, Malaysia, Brunei, and the Philippines to cede their territorial waters in recognition of China's illegitimate claim over the South China Sea. Such would be the likely outcome, as the United States is the only superpower that can offer any meaningful challenge to Russia and China's use of force against weaker countries.
A near collision between a Chinese and a Philippine patrol boat in the South China Sea has exposed the feuding that still exists between the countries over disputed territory. Now, that's despite recent efforts to ease tensions.
By choosing to arm Ukraine, the United States sent a signal to autocratic regimes in Russia and China that it was willing to use force to defend established international law. Other Western powers followed suit, which preemptively prevented the Ukraine crisis from morphing into a new global conquest with Russia, China, North Korea, and other junta regimes in Africa as the Axis powers. While the US may have spent tens of billions it would have used to address homelessness, drug addiction, and the immigration crisis at the southern border, it prevented a future need to risk American lives and the resources that would have been expended fighting a Third World War in Europe and Asia.